Hi, this video will demonstrate how to multiply and divide complex numbers. Okay, remember, whenever we have the square root of -1, we can simply rewrite that as I. In other words, when I have a negative on the under the radical, I'm just going to bring it out front and make it I. All right, and for that reason, I squared is then equal to -1. The instructions will say to express in standard form. All right, and so typically standard form is a number. All right, like a plus or minus some b and I. In other words, we write our real part and then we have an imaginary part. Here we're basically multiplying. And now whenever you're multiplying these out, all right, treat the I as if it were an X, okay? So when we have two things that we're multiplying like this, then we know we need to use FOIL. First, 1 times 2 is 2. Outer 1 times -3i is a -3i. Inner I times 2 is a positive 2i. All right. And then last I've got I times -3i, and that's going to be -3i squared. Okay. Now again, just treat your i's like x until you get to this point. Once I reach this point, I can do a simple substitution, because notice whenever I end up with an I squared, I can put in a -1. So notice here I've ended up with an I squared, so I'm simply going to replace that with -1. So we end up with 2. I can combine these two, all right, just as if they were x. I got -3i and a positive 2i. That's going to give me a -I. And then now in this last term, I have -3 times a -1, so that's going to become a positive 3. Now I can combine my 2 and 3, and my answer becomes 5 minus I. Okay, so again, we're just treating the I like the X with one exception. Whenever we end up with I squared, we're going to want to substitute in -1. Let's try another example. Here I'm just going to FOIL this out. -2 times 1 is -2. -2 times the -2i is going to give me a positive 4i. I times 1 is just an I. And then last I get I times a -2i. That's going to yield a -2i squared. Now you can see here, once again, I've ended up with my I squared. So what I'm going to do in this case is pop in that -1. All right, so I've got -2. I can combine these two terms, 5i plus 1i equals 5i. Okay, and then over here I've got -2 times the -1, so that's going to actually yield a positive 2. In this example, my -2 plus 2 yields 0, so I'm going to actually be left with just 5i. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about dividing. All right, we're really not dividing by the imaginary unit. In math, we really hate to have the imaginary unit in the denominator. And so what we want to do is get rid of it. And the way we get rid of the I in the denominator is by multiplying by the conjugate of the denominator. The conjugate, all I'm going to do is simply change this sign. If it's negative, I'm going to make it positive. If it's positive, I'm going to make it negative. So I'm going to multiply by the conjugate of my denominator, which actually is 5 plus I. Again, to do the conjugate, just change your sign. And now whatever I do in the numerator, I need to do in the denominator. So I'm just going to multiply the numerator by the conjugate and the denominator. Again, this is going to be FOIL. I get 4 times 5 is 20. I get 4 times I is 4I. I get I times 5 is 5I, and then I get I times I is I squared, okay? But now we know that in place of this, I can pop in that -1, okay? Same thing in my denominator, but watch what happens here. I get 5 times 5 is 25. 5 times I is a positive 5I. Minus I times 5 is a negative 5I. And then minus I times positive I is a -I squared. And now we all know we can pop in for the I squared a -1. But notice in my denominator that my 5I and my -5I cancel, and so I have in essence gotten rid of the I in my denominator because the I squared became -1. That is why we multiply by the conjugate. So in my numerator, I've got 20 minus 1. My numerator becomes 19. I've got 4i plus 5i becomes 9i. And my denominator, I end up with 25. But now, look, this is minus a minus 1. So this is going to be a positive 1. So we end up with 26. Let's try one more example. Over here, I'm going to multiply by my conjugate. So again, I'm just going to change the sign. But here it's positive. So my conjugate is 1 minus 2i over 1 minus 2i. Okay? My numerator, I get 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times minus 2i is a minus 6i. Minus 2i times 1 is a minus 2i. And minus 2i times minus 2i is a positive 4i squared. Okay? My denominator becomes 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times minus 2i is a minus 2i. 1 times 2i is a positive 2i. And 2i times a minus 2i is a minus 4i squared. Simplifying, we would get, in the numerator I get 3, and then this becomes a minus 4, okay, because I've replaced I squared with negative 1. So I get negative 1. And then I've got minus 6i minus 2i is a minus 8i. And my denominator becomes, I've got 1, and now if I put in a negative 1 for my I squared, this can be 1 plus 4, which becomes 5. And then notice again that my minus 2i and my positive 2i cancel out. Okay, and so traditionally we would write this as minus 1/5 because we want to write our real part, and then we would say minus 8 over 5i because we want to write our real part and then our imaginary part. So this would be traditionally how we write our answer. This is okay with 5 in the denominator here, but traditionally we write it this way. So again, to write something in standard form when you've got an I in the denominator, simply multiply by the conjugate. And when you're multiplying things that have the imaginary unit in them, remember to substitute I squared with negative 1.